So we're going to be going over assignment number 3, and I'm going to teach you how to solve the problem as if I was approaching it. So before we go through this, make sure you read the requirements for assignment number 3, and that'll help give you the background you need for as we go through this. So I've just created a basic user interface in order to meet all of the different requirements, and I'm just going to go through now and show you how I'm going to create the methods, how I would do it for each of these. So first, let's kind of go into here, and I need to start thinking through the attributes of my class that I'm going to need to save away the data. So again, if we go back to our UI here, we notice, for instance, we have number of students, number of assignments, and so we know that we're going to have to create some arrays to hold the students' names and to hold all of the assignments for each of the students. So behind the scenes, we'll create some arrays. We're also going to have to keep track of like how many students we have, how the number of students, the number of assignments, and so those are the variables we're going to have to start with. So first, we need something like, I number of students. We need something like, I number of assignments. And so these variables, you're going to set them, once the user has submitted them, and so the rest of our application can use these variables. So we know the size of arrays, we know where the bounds are, things like that. So we're also going to need a variable. When you think about this user interface here, there's this navigate section. And so you can see that we're going to need to keep track of which student index we're on in our array. So what we need to do is something like, I selected student index. So that would start off as 0. As you click next, it would increment by 1. Previous would decrement by 1. First student would go to 0. Last student would go to the number of students, basically, is what we're going to keep track there. The next one we're going to need is a string array called SA students names. And we're also going to need an integer array that's multidimensional, that's student scores. So now you'll notice that student names, I've made just a single dimensional string array. Now why is that? Because as we're navigating through the students, you only have to save the student's name away. So we have a single dimensional array that holds just the strings for the student's names. Now, when we're saving the scores though, we need a multidimensional array, kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. You can think of it in memory. And that's what this array is going to do. So it just has each row belongs to a given student, and each column is one of the student's scores. So that's what that's going to look like there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start going through just piece by piece of how we would outline this. Now in the real world, this would be done different, but we haven't learned a lot of the concepts with different classes and other techniques. So we're just going to keep it simple on how I would solve it with the things we've learned so far in this class. So I'll also keep that in mind. So let's start with these top methods, the submit counts and the resets. Now I've already gone ahead and double clicked all of the buttons for us, so we've generated all the methods and things like that just to save time. Nothing we need to worry about in the constructor, but let's talk about this resets scores click. So when the user clicks reset scores, we're going to need to do a few things to our window. So one, we're just going to want to reset the window. So what does that mean? Well, one of the things I would recommend is after they submit the counts, I would enable all this down here. So right now what I would do is I would go into this and I would actually disable all of these different things. So I would just do something like this and make it disabled. And I would do that for all of these controls down here. Then when they submitted the counts, I would enable this. Then when you reset the counts, I would then re-enable this up here. And that way, you'll notice when I run the application then that none of these buttons could be clicked and no values can even be entered. So that's why I would disable all of these first. So on the reset scores, I would then I'd reset the wing and then enable the top, and disable the bottom part again. That's really all there is to the disable scores, not a whole lot to it. Next, we're going to talk about submit the button counts. So we know the user has to give us the number of students and the number of assignments, and they're going to submit the counts. So what's the first thing we need to do? Well, we need to validate the user input. So validate user input. Now I would probably create a separate method for this called validate user input. And what does it do? It validates that they've entered in the correct values for number of students and the correct number of assignments. And if it's invalid, then you need to display some red error labels if it's invalid. So display error labels. If it's invalid. If the data is valid, we don't have to worry about it. So now we can enable the bottom part of the screen if the data is valid. If it's not valid, we wouldn't do that. If it's valid, what we need to now do is we need to create our arrays, really instantiate them. Because you notice right here, we just created the object references and we haven't used the new keyword. So how do we create these arrays? Well, we use the new keyword, but what size do we create each array? Well, the student names, you can see that's how many number of students. So if they entered in 5 students, then we instantiate this string array to have 5 student names in it. For student scores, the rows is the number of students and the columns is the number of assignments. So now that we know the counts, we can create the student scores array. And now we've got those all set up for us. So the next part of our application is the navigation. And so this is where we start finding some common errors that students make because they don't validate the data as we're navigating through this. So let's take a look at the first student. So what does that mean? It means we want to display the first student's data. Well, we've got this variable up here called iSelectedStudentIndex. Now it tells us, hey, which student to display. So what we'd want to do, since we're on the first student, just set that equal to 0. And then display the student's data. And we know that that's the index. Now we really don't, there's not much validation on this one because no matter how many times you click the first button, we just set that to 0, then we display the student's name. And so what that means is we use this index in this array for the student's name array, and we just display that student right here. Or, sorry, right here. So we display the student's name. So next, we've got our previous. So this means we're actually going back. So what this means is we need to move the student index down by 1. Here, I'll just copy some of these comments over here. But now we have to be careful because if we subtract 1 from this right now and it's at 0, we'd get a -1. So obviously, if it's at 0, don't decrement by 1, but again, just display the student's name. But this is the bug I see a lot in students' code. So the next, we're going to do something very similar, but we're actually just going to increment by 1. But in this one, we need to be a little careful because we can't go above the number of students. So if you entered 5 students, then you have to be careful not to go past the 4th index, because remember it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 if you'd entered 5. And then the last student, well, the last one, it's very similar to this up here, except this is going to get set to the last index. This is the last index. And again, you would have to figure out what that is. So if it was, again, 5 students, the last index would be 4 based on that. So now we can come down here to our save score, or sorry, save the score. So we can open this up now, and we've got our, save name, then save score. So once we go to the saved name, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to validate the user's name. So validate the name, which in our case is really just make sure it's not blank. We're not saving to a database, so we don't have to worry about the size. We're just containing to our own local variable that's a string, so not too big a deal. Next, we need to do is we need to save the name based on the index. So what happens is as we're clicking next, previous, these buttons here, we're incrementing this variable, this selected student index. So now all we have to do is on this save name click, we just use this variable and then we save the name in this array here, this SA students names array, based on that index. And that's all there is to that one. Now the score click, let's go down to that one. So this is another place where I see a lot of bugs, and so what we want to do is we first want to validate this data. So we know the assignment number, which again is going to be based off this number up here, and then we know the assignment score has to be between 0 and 100. So again, we always want to make sure we validate data. And if the data is invalid, then we're going to display some red error labels to the user. Kind of up to you where you want to display them. A lot of times I'll just display them right next to this. I may have to remove these buttons, right, if you're going to display the error labels there, but it's completely up to you how you want to do that. So first thing, we validate the data. So again, assignment scores between 1 and the number entered, and then assignment numbers between 1 and the number entered by the user. The score is 0 to 100, then display the error label. If not, then what we can do is we can save the student's score to an array. So we can just come in here. Now, we know which student is selected, so this is the row. And then we'll notice that they're entering the assignment score. So if they'd entered 5 assignments on here, they could enter a value between 1 and 5. So the value here, let's say they entered assignment score 3. So what we actually need to do is actually take the second index. Because remember, it's going to be 0 through 4. So you always have to minus 1 from whatever value they entered here. And you've already validated it, so it should be correct there. Now we've saved the data into our score. So now we can go ahead and we can display our scores. So the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out, based on how many assignments, we need to generate the header. So the header is going to have something like just the text student, and then we have to increment, print out how many number of assignments. So, number of assignments. So you have to say number 1, tab, then number 2, then tab number 3. So if we had 5 assignments, we'd want to have a for loop, right? That loop through 5 times and print it out number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're just printing out the header. So you're just printing out number 1, number 2, number 3 for however many assignments are then going to be displayed down below. So again, it's just going to create some sort of header, and you've seen this on the assignment requirements, something like this. It doesn't have to be exact, but it'll be like that. So now we're going to need 2 for loops. So the outer for loop, we're going to use that to loop through the students. And so what we're doing is we're going to generate this big long string that we're actually eventually going to assign it to this text box here. So we got the outer loop through the students. So all we're doing is looping through this student array, and then we grab the name, print it out. Then we're going to have an inner for loop where we're actually looping through the scores right here. So remember, outer for loop means we're going to add the name, and then inner for loop where we're going to loop through the scores. So that's what that inner for loop is going to do. So all of this is just creating one row. So that's going to be displayed below this. So below this is going to be the student's name, and then because we have that for loop, we're going to loop through and print out the score for 1, put a tab character, and then you're just going to continue to add the scores. Then what we have to do is, as we're doing that inner for loop, we need to add up and then calculate the average. And so that'll give us this average grade. Then what we can do is we need to actually now calculate the letter grade. So I would recommend, creating some sort of, method called grade letter or whatever that you could pass the average into, and then that would then give you the grade letter. So we would then call this method up here, and that would print out that last part of that string. And then our loop would come back up, it would print out the next student, or I shouldn't say print out, it would add it to the string. And then we'd add the string with all the scores, and then after we're all said and done, we'd assign that string to our text box here. And that should be a basic outline. Again, that's not all the requirements for this assignment, so please make sure you read through everything, but that should kind of get you going. Thank you.